Childhood memories may seem as though they sort of come and go. They can fade with time and details are often blurred. Occasionally, early memories appear to be cemented in your mind and you would possibly even bet money on their accuracy. However, those memories, no matter how certain we may be about them, might not be as true to life as we think. In fact, childhood memories are the most vulnerable to becoming altered by subconscious changes each time we recall the details of them. Dr. Daniela Schiller of the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, along with a group of peers she worked with at New York University, have conducted pointed research and studies into the nature of memories obtained as youths, which has given us some insight about our own mind's accuracy when it comes to recalling our most early memories. According to Dr. Schiller, not only are our memories faulty, but more importantly, many tend to change each time they are recalled. What we recall is only a facsimile of moments gone by. We may describe our memories by comparing them to Swiss cheese, but with what we now know, a more accurate comparison is more like processed cheese. What we remember changes each time we recall the event. The slightest changed memory is now embedded as real, only to be reconstructed with the next recall. Now, this doesn't mean that everything we recall from our childhood is destined to become some reconstructed web of totally false recollections. Our brains recall most of the larger, more prominent details, then fills in the blanks with the smaller ones as it sees possibly correct. So, although these minute details being wrong is highly likely, our brains do try their very best to replace the incorrect recalls as logically as possible. Now, with all that being said, there is one childhood memory that a shocking number of people claim to remember. Countless people from all around the world of all ages, spanning multiple decades and generations, can be found on Reddit and a number of other online discussion forums, including many that I personally came across dating back to at least a decade ago. Almost everyone who chimes in on this particular discussion has a strikingly similar and very specific memory, and they all tend to share the same inquisitive question. What was that S thing we used to draw as kids? I was 80s born and 90s raised in the United States. In the early to mid 90s, I remember drawing this thing a lot. My actual first name starts with an S, so I was always perfecting my technical ability of this style of S in its simplest form and would occasionally put forth an artsy spin when I was drawing on something that wasn't just going to be chunked after class. I remember multiple kids in every school I went to and every town that we moved to all drew the same S, with very little differences in the small details of it. From my recollection, almost everyone would use the S from time to time as a part of a word and other times as a standalone design. The design seemed to be most popular amongst middle school age children, and finding at least one of these S's on any random 7th grader's book cover or binder was no difficult feat. The kids with a more rebellious side sometimes liked showing their S drawing skills on bathroom stalls and sometimes lockers. Either way, this thing was everywhere. Skimming through dozens of Reddit posts on this topic and using Google to find current and older posts of the same subject, I read through quite a few threads where the S was being discussed randomly over the past 10 years. There are still current discussions popping up about it in present time as well. Now, where things become less unified in memory between commenters is the basic history behind the S. Even what it is called is constantly up for debate. It has been called a number of different names, and geographical influence doesn't play much of a role that I can tell. It has been known to have names such as the Stussy S, the Universal S, the Cool S, the Pointy S, the Superman S, the Super S, the Graffiti S, and the S Factor. Some are used more often than others, to some extent, but no single name stands out as a clear majority. The most commonly used names seem to be Cool, Pointy, and Stussy. If I had to guess, Stussy may be the most recognized label for it, but oddly enough, Stussy is one of the least fitting names of all, along with the name Superman. But as I mentioned before, I was reading threads on this topic dating as far back as late 2009 and have learned some new information since then. Nothing definitive, but we can rule a couple of things out for sure. On July 26th of 2016, Julian Morgan with the Vice magazine wrote an article on this very topic with the headline that reads, "What the hell was that S thing everyone drew in school?" The link will be down below in the description box. At 8 years old, Julian was introduced to the S and found it to be quite an addictive thing to doodle on all of his school book covers. He recently Googled the S and learned how widespread the acknowledgement of it was worldwide and decided to find out as much info as he could. He started by conducting his own mini-study with people in his office. The responses that he got from his colleagues led him to picking up the phone, and he eventually narrowed the history and appropriate name down by 2. The first call Julian made was to DC Comics. So many people throughout multiple countries all over the world have expressed that their memory of the S was being an old Superman logo. In the article, Julian recounts his call with Benjamin LeClaire, which manages the comic library at the DC studio in Burbank, California. Benjamin confirmed that the S has nothing to do with Superman. "It doesn't look like any of the emblems from the old Superman shield logos," LeClaire said after rummaging through the archived collection. "His S has a lot of open space and almost never connects to itself." I found this image showcasing the logo styles throughout the decades and agreed with that assessment. The S in question is distinct in its own right by not having any curved elements at all. The design is comprised of 14 straight lines, and the Superman S has always had a curvy design, making it a far more standard S shape in comparison to the so-called Superman S. With that theory being fully dismissed, I would also argue that we could disregard the name the Super S as well. Next on Julian's call list was Stussy. Julian writes, "Pretty much every forum on the web mentions Stussy, the Californian surf streetwear company founded in the 80s. A lot of people seem convinced that the symbol was originally a Stussy logo, so I called them." From what Julian claims, he spoke with a longtime employee of the company and asked her about the company's possible association with the mysterious letter design. "No, this is not an original Stussy logo," stated Amy Coates, who has worked alongside owner Sean Stussy since 1985. "I personally get asked this a lot, but people have been drawing this S long before Stussy was even established. People have just assumed that it was Stussy, and it sort of just spread from there. It actually is quite amusing." And with that, we have 3 names and 2 starting points that have been long debated that we can knock off the list. The final call that Julian made was not to a company, although he contemplated contacting Suzuki. But if you look at the Suzuki logo, you can tell that the similarities are not close enough to be a match, and it wasn't promising enough to even be a potential match. I actually looked for variations of the Suzuki logo, thinking maybe there was an older version that held a more similar technique and style with the stylized S, but I didn't find anything much different from the current logo design. They all seem to have stayed pretty consistent with their branding, and so I decided to rule this theory out as well. Julian wanted to get an expert opinion, so he contacted an expert in symbols and semiotics, Professor Paul Colby at Middlesex University in London. Paul was familiar with the design and proceeded to state his opinion on a couple of other widespread theories. He stated that the theory that it was a hair metal band symbol was ridiculous. "It's certainly not the Saxton logo," he said. "Theirs was far more sharp and had a staff." Then he offered the most likely yet bland explanation of all. That is, that it's just fun to draw. Following his hairband theory lead, I decided to look up not only the Saxton logo, which is farther from the stylized S than any of the other theories that we talked about so far, but also the Styx logo. Personally, this isn't in the possibility category for me either, so I'm tossing that idea as well. Paul also said that the reason why kids go through this phase of drawing this S is because it's a Mobius strip, referring to the type of one-surfaced loop shape that M.C. Escher was fond of drawing. It can't be drawn continuously, but it does have a perpetual flow. The style of S in question does have a Mobius strip type of aspect to it in its own right, but I'm not convinced that the strep has anything to do with the S's phenomenon of school children in as many places around the world as it has. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure many kids have done the demonstrative experiments to observe the complexity of the Mobius's final form by cutting a piece of paper, twisting a full turn, and attaching the ends like many websites, science books, and online videos explain. They may experiment with it and find it to be interesting as anything else, but it is highly unlikely that all the kids just rushed to grab a pencil after they tried to make the paper Mobius to compare the 3D characteristics of it with the 2D characteristics and flow pattern abilities of the S. So although he is the expert, I'm making a personal decision to politely decline his theory and move on. As for the other assumed names, I feel a couple more can be eliminated in the attempt to narrow it down a bit, but these are strictly my thoughts and reasonings. That being said, I am next eliminating the Surfer S, with Stussy being the surfer attire brand and the theory of the S being a Stussy S for so long by so many. I feel that the suggestion that this is just a play on the Stussy theory is pretty likely, which we know from Leclerc's investigation is fully ruled out. I'm also personally ruling out the Graffiti S. This is my least confident ruling out decision, but I can explain why I came to this decision quite simply. I found there to be a lack of photographic evidence on this particular S being a predominant design in the world of graffiti. A simple Google search for the Graffiti S will provide tons of examples of graffiti art with S's in them, and almost all of the results, both mock-ups and photographed final products, have the similar style of S, but it isn't the S that we're talking about. There is one more aspect to the Graffiti S theory before we move on that I feel that I should just throw out there. There was a period of time where this particular S did get popular enough within people who like to go tag things up, particularly on school grounds and other areas and public places where it was considered vandalism, and they would sometimes spray paint this particular S. Eventually, teachers and other authority figures decided that they felt that this was gang-related somehow, and they ended up banning the symbol from many schools, and not only here in the United States, but in other countries as well. Although this detail is worth mentioning due to the theory being so widespread, it's not backed by enough evidence to suggest certainty in calling it the Graffiti S. Actually, there are tons of testimonies of people drawing this far earlier than the art of graffiti has been predominant. Of all the names on my list, the S factor is probably going to be the very least likely. Reason being is I only found a mention of it on Wikipedia, and they didn't have any details on where the name came from or why they feel that it could be possibly called that, and I haven't even found a single commenter in any forum that I read about this subject that mentions calling it that either. So with this being the least likely on my list, it's automatically disqualified. And now we've got our top 3 that I feel are the most likely names that it could be. The Universal S, the Cool S, and the Pointy S are all understandable possibilities, and I can see why any 3 of them would be used. The Pointy S is a very matter-of-fact take on its structural design, so it makes sense. The Cool S also makes sense because the S is, well, pretty cool. But without having fact-based knowledge on the specific origins of the symbol with no room for debate, I have no choice but to merely give my own hypothesis and opinionated take on the matter. In my opinion, the Universal S is the most appropriate name with everything I've learned and considered. There's no company or product that we can associate with the symbol, and there's no time period that we can attribute without a shadow of a doubt to its beginnings. We can't even pinpoint an originating continent to play off of when naming the highly discussed childhood letter art. After skimming tons of Reddit comments and other forum discussions on the matter, I was honestly taken aback by the number of countries this thing has been known to exist in. Schools all over the world for at least the past 60 years have had students who claim to have drawn this symbol, many of them having at least 2 things in common. 1, their peers and friends were drawing it, so they wanted to join in on the trend. And 2, it's just an interesting looking symbol, and it can be upscaled with adding color and more design elements, including a few more lines creating a 3D appearance and a drop shadow, and this made it a little more fun to doodle while in class. Lastly, I did come across one last bit of information that seems to be more common than most other personal experiences discussed about this topic. One of the most common schoolhouse uses the universal S can be attributed to is the word smile. Children everywhere have at some point highly likely written the word smile on their notebook, with the universal S adding a bit of pizzazz to a simple yet positive request, to smile. I wasn't able to solve this mystery and may not have found more information that we weren't already aware of to inch us closer to doing so. But I am actually very pleased with the suggestion and with my decision to investigate this massive childhood mystery, because I got the opportunity to quietly witness a semi-subconscious positivity push by many kids all around the world. The one-word positive message was represented to their peers whether they realized it or not at the time. But there's a 60-plus-year-old worldwide movement that was seemingly unplanned that silently presented to others without a single verbal spoken word, which held a worldwide reminder simply to smile.